Hello everyone, my name is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx, and what I'm going to be talking to you about today is dialectics. Now, about a month or so ago, I did a video unfolding how Marxist materialist philosophy comes about. I spoke about the pre-Socratics, some of the 17th and 18th century French and English materialists, and I juxtaposed both of those traditions of materialism to Marxist. And one of the things that I mentioned was that Marxist materialism was a dialectical materialism. Now, what does that mean? Well, the dialectical world outlook, in its most simplest of formulations, is a world outlook that sees the world in constant change. Rather than seeing the world as constant, or seeing the world as fixated, as a metaphysical worldview would have it, the dialectical world outlook sees the world as in constant change. And thus, in the ancient Eastern traditions, in the thought of Buddha, and in the thought of Lao Tzu, you have a dialectical world outlook. In the ancient Western traditions of Greece, you have a dialectical world outlook. In Plato, in Aristotle, in the pre-Socratics. The one I'm going to talk about today, which is the one that I think systematizes the best dialectics, at least of the ancients, is a thinker by the name of Heraclitus. Heraclitus was an Ionian philosopher, and of these pre-Socratics, all we have is short quotes. So I think of Heraclitus, what we have is like 4 or 5 pages worth of quotes. But in those 4 or 5 pages, we have a few important quotes that set up the basis for what ends up becoming the dialectical, or a systematized dialectic, as in Hegel, or in its materialist formulation in Marx. One of the things that Heraclitus says is, again, this world outlook that the world is in constant flux. Thus, he gives an example of a river. He says, we never step in the same river twice. Why is that? Well, because the second time we step into the river has moved, it has changed. And we ourselves have also changed by the time we step into the river for the second time. So, this is an important point that is in Engels and in this whole tradition, from Heraclitus to the Marxist tradition, which is that matter is only matter when it's in motion. There's no such thing as matter that is not in motion. Matter is always in motion. And thus, the world is always in motion. It's always in a constant flux. But Heraclitus went beyond that. The phrase that people usually stop at when they talk about Heraclitus is that one, that the world is in constant motion, in constant flux, and the river example. Heraclitus also says that the world is in motion because of the relationships between polar opposites. And this, I'm going to talk about it more systematized later on, but keep that in mind. Thus, the dialectical world outlook starts with a conception of the world that sees it not as one unified, fixated world, but as a world that is in constant change. Matter in motion. That's what the world is. The person who first systematizes the dialectics and its categories and its laws, the best is a thinker by the name of George Hegel. He does this implicitly in the phenomenology of spirit, and then later on he does it in the science of logic and the encyclopedia. So it is from this formulation of Hegel that the Marxist thought gets its kernel of the dialectics, right? And we see it in the afterword to Critique of Political Economy, which are a series of manuscripts that Marx writes in 1857 to 1859. And the afterword is written by Engels, in which he says that the Marxist tradition flips Hegel on his feet. So he was previously on his head, now it's on his feet, which that means that the materialist, the idealist conception of the dialectics gets flipped, and now it's materialist. And Marx says the same thing in the second German edition, in the afterword of the second German edition of Capital. What does that mean? Well, that Hegel had laid out these laws of the dialectics as laws of the mind, as laws of thought, and that the world was a reflection of these laws of thought, right? And he has an interesting critique of materialism, which is a critique that latter thinker, one of the fathers of phenomenology, Husserl, has of naturalism, which is that materialism, or with Husserl's naturalism, they're abstractions. They're not materialists in themselves, because you have to abstract from specific encounters of particular materials in order to have a theory of general matter. We never experience general matter. We experience particular things, color, forms, and stuff like that. But that's beyond the point for today. Maybe that would be a nice topic for another day. The point is that Hegel's dialectics is one that is seen as taking place in the mind and then reflecting itself on reality. The Marxism version says that thought is a reflection of the social conditions the beings that think are in, and thus it is from the world that we think. We never think outside of the world. We think in a position that is in the world, and our thought is a result of that world and how it's structured and how that world's dynamics takes place. So the point of the Marxist dialectics is not to bring thought into the world, but rather to look at nature and see how it is that nature functions. And from that observation of nature, what they were able to see is that these laws that were devised by Hegel from the abstract were actually in nature. So what are these laws of the dialectics? Well, the first one is that quantity turns into quality, and then quality restates. So what does quantity turning into quality mean? I think this is perhaps the easiest of the three laws. What this law refers to is the fact that a given accumulation of something leads at some point, once that accumulation is one more, to a leap which turns into something else. Okay, so think about water. Water, if you start to make it hotter, if you increase the temperature of water, you can increase quite a few degrees. But it's gonna be that 1 degree that takes it from being a liquid to being a gas. And in that degree, in that final quantity, there's a leap to a different quality. You go from liquid to gas. It's the same thing the other way around. When you're going and you're bringing the temperature of the water down, there's one specific moment in which, boom, you jump and you go from liquid to solid, water to ice. And thus quantity turns into quality. But then quality, that new quality, starts its own quantitative process. And in that quantitative process of its own special quantitative accumulation, it can turn again into another quality. And it's a continual process that's not necessarily circular, but it's more so progressive. And we'll see that later on with the other laws. So that's the first law. I think that one's pretty easy to understand. The second law is about the interpenetration of opposites. Penetration of opposites. Now this law is perhaps the most misunderstood. Why? Because when people talk of this law, they usually bring up the Kantian dialectic, and they say that a thesis interacts with an antithesis, and that leads to a synthesis, which is basically how it's formulated in the Critique of Pure Reason, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But what Kant was trying to do here was solve a problem of connection. That's not the dialectics as it's generally thought of in the Hegelian and Marxist tradition, because what you have here is a separate thing that interacts with another separate thing, and from that interaction you have a new thing, and then you have the continual process of triangles. That's how I was taught the dialectic in undergrad, and that's incorrect. If you look up any video of Hegel, that is an introductory video, that's how they teach you the dialectic. That's not necessarily right. You got to think of the dialectic and the law of the interpenetration of opposites as contained within a totality, a given whole. And within that whole, you have polar opposites. Those polar opposites interact with each other, they interpenetrate each other, one goes here, the other one goes there, and in that relationship of interpenetration is how this process of accumulation of quantity partakes, and then from that relationship you have the qualitative ship, and it has a new totality with a new relationship of polar opposites that then continue their relationships of interpenetration, their clashes and stuff, and they start accumulating. One of the important things is that in every new process of quantitative accumulation, once you have that leap towards a new quality, the polar opposites are not so clearly defined. It takes a while in quantitative accumulation for one to even be able to see the positions the polar opposites play, right? So, for example, in the class struggle, when capitalism begins to develop, you don't automatically see the class dynamics as antagonistic between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. You can begin to see it, but it takes a while and many years of development before you can start seeing the polarizing effect of the two classes. And that's natural in the law of the dialectics and the interpenetration of opposites, that when there's a qualitative leap to a new totality, it takes a while in order for those two polarities to manifest themselves as polarities and to begin then the process of their interpenetration and of their dialectic. But it's important to see this not as external things that are coming together, but as an internal process. They're both part of a unity, and they both play different functions in that unity, and they interchange each other. So let's see how Engels talks about this in Dialectics of Nature. This is a book I highly recommend for those of you that want to learn more about dialectics. It's written in 1878, and it's a series of essays on Engels' studies on nature. He spends like 8 years studying science and seeing how it is that science works, and here's where he's able to see that these theses of the dialectics are confirmed in the way that science works. So he says, the basic form of all motion is approximation and separation, contraction and expansion. In short, the old polar opposites of attraction and repulsion. Dialectics has proved from the result of our experience of nature, right? So not from thought, from our experience of nature, though as he says in I think in Anti-During, nature is the test of the dialectics. So dialectics has proved from the results of our experience of nature so far that all polar opposites in general are determined by the mutual action of the two opposite poles on each other. That the separation and opposition of these poles exist only within their mutual connection and union, and conversely, that their union exists only in their separation and their mutual connection only in their opposition. So a bit of a tongue twister, but it's really not that hard to understand. So a good example that is brought up again by one of the ancient Greeks, Plato, in his text Phaedo. He's trying to make an argument for the reincarnation of the soul. And the argument, he says, is the argument, what's known as the argument from opposites, that all things come from their opposites. And the argument basically goes as follows. The conclusion of the immortality of the soul, we don't have to accept, but the argument is that all things come from their opposites. In order to be stronger, you must have been weaker before. In order to be smaller, you must have been bigger. And in order for change to happen overall, it's a change from a state that you are in to a state that you are not in, and that difference happens through a manifestation of opposites. So the bigger comes from the smaller, and there's a necessary relationship between opposites in order for change to take place. And thus his conclusion was that if we're alive, we came from death, and when we die, we must go to life again. We don't have to accept that, but it's a good example of the interpenetration of opposites and their correlation and necessary correlation within each other within a totality. The third and final law is the negation of the negation. Now, when Engels writes Anti-During, which is in 1878, he only talks about these two. This one. Quantity and quality, and negation of negation. It is in Dialectics of Nature, which comes out in 83, so the year Marx dies, where he talks about the interpenetration of opposites. So negation of negation, what does that mean? Well, to give a very simple example, what is 2 minus negative 2 equal? Right? Is it still a negative process going on here? Is 2 minus negative 2 the same thing as 2 minus 2? It's not. Why? Because there's two negations. And what does that mean? It's basic math that it's a plus. So 2 minus negative 2 is 4. That's the basic law of negation. That when something is negated, when something is negated, that negation doesn't just land in outer space, right? That negation lands always in an affirmative. So let's see what Engels has to say about this in Anti-Düring. He says, a very simple process is taking place everywhere and every day that any child can understand as soon as it is stripped of the veil of mystery behind which was hidden by the old idealist philosophy, so like Hegel and stuff, and behind which it is to the advantage of helpless metaphysicians of Herr Düring caliber to keep it hidden. He says, let us take a grain of barley. Billions of such grains of barley are milled, boiled, and brewed, and then consumed. But if such a grain of barley meets with conditions which are normal for it, if it falls on suitable soil, then under the influence of heat and moisture, a specific change occurs in it. It germinates. The grain as such ceases to exist. It is negated. And in its place there appears the plant which has risen from it, the negation of the grain. But what is the normal life process of this plant? It grows, flowers, it fertilizes, and finally once more produces a grain of barley. And as soon as these have ripened, the stalk dies and in its turn is negated. As a result of this negation of negation, we have the original grain of barley once again, but not as a single unit, but 10 times and 20 times as much. And then he ends up saying not just more, but also a better quality. So I was scrolling through TikTok, and I know a lot of our audience is pretty young, so you're probably on TikTok. I was scrolling through TikTok the other day, and I saw a video of a pepper that was sliced open, and one of the seeds inside was plucked out. And that seed was put in the soil, as he states, it was watered and it was taken care of. And that seed ends up becoming a plant. That plant ends up flowering. The flowers end up getting a new pepper. And it ends up growing from one little seed, of which the pepper had hundreds. From one little seed, you get a plant with 3 peppers, and each pepper itself has hundreds of seeds. This is the process of the negation of the negation. Once something is eliminated, a new thing grows, and then that process is progressive and it makes things better, and it makes things more. It allows for the exponential growth of peppers, for example. So these 3 basic laws, at one point they were derived from Hegel's mind, in relation, of course, to his observations of nature. But the importance in Marxism is that these laws are not just taken for granted from Hegel, right? Engels, what he's doing is looking at nature, or in Marxist theory of classes, looking at human interaction in history, human social relations, and seeing what are the laws by which change is structured. We know that change is constant, we experience that, but what are the laws that are structuring these changes? And what you see over and over again in scientific discoveries, and if you get a good book, a newer copy, this is from well-read publications, it has a good introduction that shows some of the scientific discoveries after Engels' death that have even more so confirmed the theses that he proposes in the laws of the dialectics. But what you see when you study nature is that this is how movement takes place, through these different laws, right? So this is, again, not a projection of the mind onto the world, but it is from the study of the world that we understand how it moves. So, yeah, these are the laws of the dialectics. I don't think it's too hard to understand. Like Engels mentions in that quote that I read, it has been made a lot harder to understand by idealist philosophers that try to sound cool while they're doing this, but it's generally laws that are pretty simple to understand, and that once you grasp them and you look at the world, you can start to understand the world better, because it really is how the world's change is taking place in terms of structurally. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have anything else that you want me to cover in terms of Marxism, please let me know in the comments if you have any suggested topics. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends who might be interested. And yeah, see ya.